All right, now let's see if I can get back to my slides. Can you still see the slides?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. All right, sorry about that, everyone. So again, welcome. My name is Carrie Brosnan with the Franklin County NRCD. A little bit of background on the Franklin County Conservation District. We really aim to empower and partner with land stewards and communities to support connections that benefit natural resources, water quality, soil health, and the working landscape here in Franklin County and across Northwest Vermont. We partner with landowners, farmers, and community members on conservation efforts across the region. We're really glad to be facilitating this listening session on Act 59, or the Vermont Conservation Plan. This listening session is an opportunity for you all to learn about the conservation plan and to provide questions, comments, and feedback directly to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Your input matters, and we're really glad to have you all here. A quick look at our agenda for the night. Did that change for you, Arena?
Yes.
Great. We're going to start with a little introduction and agenda. That's what we're doing now. Then I'm going to hand it off to Trey with VHCB to do his presentation on Act 59. Then we'll go around the room and the virtual room for community member introductions, which will take around 30 minutes. And then we'll set aside an hour for really diving into discussion questions and feedback specifically on the plan. Before I pass it over to Trey, I just want to ground us together in a few shared expectations. So as we get into the questions and feedback portion of the night, we ask that everybody keep their comments to around 5 minutes max so that as many voices as possible can be heard tonight. So just be mindful of sharing the time. We want everyone to have a chance to speak who wishes to. And most importantly, we ask that everyone remain respectful, even when you disagree. Let's make sure that we're leading with kindness and curiosity. And with that, I thank you all for being here and for your contributions to this conversation. And I'll hand things over to Trey, the Director of Conservation and Rural Community Development from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And here, I'll stop sharing my screen.
I will start sharing mine. Can you all see that okay?
Yes.
Great, great. Well, I'm also really glad to see some friends who I've met before and some people I haven't met yet on the screen or see some names up there. So welcome. I just want to echo what Carrie said, that it's really important that we hear from community members and that we create understanding about public processes like this that do affect the work of state agencies and community partners and municipalities and do have an impact on how the state budgets and spends its money. So this is part of our process is to make sure people understand that and understand the priorities and the perspectives that we bring. And so I just wanted to start. We're talking about the Vermont Conservation Plan, which is, some people talk about, they call it Act 59 because that's the act number from 2023 when it passed. But before I get into that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, because we were asked by the legislature to lead a process to develop a recommended plan for Vermont to conserve 30% of the state by 2030 and 50% by 2050. Or to mostly conserve it by 2050, but also use other tools like regulations and use value to help protect the landscape. But it's important who does the work and to acknowledge the perspectives and biases of the people who lead efforts. And VHCB is an organization that really tries to see problems outside of silos or outside of single buckets. Our approach to all of our work is thinking about like the and in our name. That we aren't just a developer, we aren't just a conservation organization. We're a whole lot more than that. And what we really value most is when we see our values, multiple values expressed in projects where we bring taxpayer money back to communities. So the Muddy Moose project in Morristown is not only a great conservation outcome because it's a beautiful 150-acre parcel with great trails and public access and waters flowing down to the Lamoille River and wetlands, surrounding the river. But it's also a place where there were 9 vacation homes that people were using, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we were able to convert them into community housing, most of which is permanently affordable. So it was a really cool. It was an outcome where we have permanent housing, more access to this beautiful place for the whole community, and knowing that we're protecting that whole watershed, kind of from the top of the valley right down to the receiving water. So that perspective of co-benefits is what we bring to this effort. So we didn't just want to make a plan for conserving and protecting the landscape, but thinking about the communities that access it. So I gotta advance slides a little differently here with Google, but so you bear with me. I'm not quite as nifty as Carrie with advancing them. I'm going to roll them forward. But here's the act that the legislature passed in 2023. Down at the bottom there, you can see the goals. I mentioned those earlier. That's how a lot of people think about that. We would acknowledge and ask people to acknowledge that 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 aren't really scientific goals. They're more like aspirational goals. There was no specific analysis done that said Vermont will be in really good ecological shape if we get to this percentage or that percentage. But a lot of people around the country and around the world have been talking about how to protect wildlands and farms and places that surround our communities and integrate our communities into those places in a way that does sort of look like what Half Earth talks about, or what 30% goals talk about, is having communities that are surrounded by working forests and working farms, and having those connect to the places where we recreate and up into the matrix forest, the places that are most ecologically sensitive and most important to kind of protect in their unmanaged capacity. So, but this plan, again, we don't think about it as much about the numbers as we think about that vision, and we spent a lot of time thinking about how to hear from Vermonters and reflect our values around that vision. So ecological function and connection in the landscape for sure. Biodiversity, watershed, climate resilience. We talk a lot about that in Vermont, but we also talk a lot about the people who make their living on the land and who access conserved lands, working farms and forests, recreation, hunting, fishing, trapping, also people who go in the woods just to renew or to bird watch. We're really interested in people having that connection to the natural world. And we really want to support the way we live on the landscape. Not that the downtowns at the confluence of all the rivers is perfect. We also know that we need to protect those downtowns too. We need to do what we can both upstream and in communities to make it possible to live by the rivers. So just going forward, and by the way, that's that the Shutesville Wildlife Corridor is a little bit southeast of you all. It's down closer to Montpelier, but it's a place where 2 major state forests come together, separated by the Winooski River, the highway, the railroads line, and Route 2. So there's a disconnection between these 2 major ecosystems. And so one of the things we talk about in this plan is landscape connection and figuring out how to create and permanently protect the places where those landscapes touch. A lot of that's in streams and crossing under roads and culverts, but some of it is more out west. They've even built bridges for wildlife passage, and I don't think that's what Vermont needs, but the Fish and Wildlife folks in VTrans have really thought about how to create bigger culverts that allow all kinds of mammals and other species to kind of pass underneath the infrastructure. So kind of a cool way to think about the map as connecting those places. The statistics here again are numbers that we've collected over the years. We know that Vermont is seeing a lot of development. A lot of development is needed. We do want more housing in Vermont. That's part of VHCB's work. We don't like to see as much kind of transformation of rural landscapes and working farms into housing, because a lot of that is low density sort of rural development that often makes it harder for communities to be farming communities or working lands communities, but also kind of eliminate that connectivity and function when you break a 200-acre parcel up into 10 or 25 to 10 acre parcels, usually there's a pretty big ecological impact there and function impact. We also feel a lot of urgency just because of the impacts of climate change and the way that it's hit us. And when it hit Montpelier a couple of summers ago, the thing that sort of astounded people who were watching is that the high schoolers and the middle schoolers and young people and even a lot of professionals left their jobs and spent the whole summer cleaning out the basements and buildings that had been impacted by the floods. And they went into those buildings without protective gear or masks or anything like that, and spent time in basements cleaning out like at the bakery, taking all the bread and dough and flour that was ruined out, or in somebody's home, cleaning out all of their possessions. But the floodwaters were filled with the worst things in the world. And our children were down there, and they were cleaning up, and they were exposed to it. And when the flood dried, the dust was like just a toxic mess. And what went downstream in that flood was also pretty toxic. So, those flood events are sure, we can have forest fragmentation or parcelization, but those big flood events cause so much damage and so much harm that we have to think about strategies that protect our river, sort of natural assets that attenuate flood damage and reconnect them. Don't just conserve them, but reconnect floodplains and rivers and wetlands so that we actually do a better job of buffering our downtowns. So we've been working on this since 2023, and the first thing we did, the legislature asked us to tell them what was already protected and how it fit into the scheme of Act 59. And the scheme, again, was this 30 by 30, 50 by 50 of permanently conserved land that fits into these categories. So how much of permanently conserved land is an ecological reserve? How much is a biodiversity conservation area? How much is forest and natural cover that's being like a working forest? And how much is working farmland that's agriculture and open land? And again, the focus is on permanent conservation. So that means it's like land that's owned by a community or by the state or by the federal government. It's land that's protected by easements or by other permanent, enforceable mechanisms in the land records. And it's 27% right now. And that's a huge number, and it reflects decades of work to identify and protect the places that communities cherish, like Darling Hill and Burke, which is sort of a recent addition to the Kingdom Trails strategy of like really protecting that landscape that's includes working farms and a lot of working forest land, but the trails bring so many visitors there that it's obviously a huge boon to local economy. So conservation to make permanent those investments communities make is one of the things that we think of as a good outcome. To meet the 2030 goal that the legislature set, it would take 189,000 more acres to be permanently protected. That would be moving almost twice as fast or even 3 times as fast as we ever have before. And so we were a little worried about that because we don't want to just try to meet those acreage goals. We want to do this in a way that really creates more access, more understanding, more community involvement in the decisions while continuing to do the things that we've been doing well already, but kind of innovating and doing new things as well. And so it may take longer than the next 5 years to reach this goal. But again, we think that goal is just something to say, oh, good, we've gotten there. Whoops. That inventory also included we captured 500 pages of notes from meetings and focus groups and conversations with Vermonters that really reflected on a lot of the questions that go into how do you plan for landscape protection. And so we already had a really good base of input and understanding from especially conservation organizations and agencies and people who are really on the kind of the front lines of this work, but also a lot of landowners and community groups and others who joined into that inventory phase. And so we took all that learning and we tried to apply it to the questions the legislature asked of us. So you can see these 4 questions, or these 4 kind of please do this. This is what they want in a conservation plan. So make a plan that helps us to really focus on conserving the agricultural land, forests, historic properties, and surface waters. Make a plan that really uses the Agency of Natural Resources scientific framework called Vermont Conservation Design as a guide. Make a plan that really increases equitable access to conserved lands, but also to the enterprises on them. And look for ways to really add ecological health and connectivity and function and resilience to the programs you're already doing. So enhance the work that's already there. Don't create a lot of new infrastructure and programs. Obviously, we need innovations, we need innovation to do this work, but we also we don't want to reinvent the wheel of how the state does business where it's working well. And so things like the investments that the communities up in the Northeast Kingdom did here. This photo here is from Valley Brook in Morgan, where a bunch of very small community organizations access Agency of Natural Resources conservation money and VHCB conservation money to restore a whole stretch of stream it restored a brook trout fishery. It restored the connections to the upland, kind of the upland forests and headwaters areas where those trout spawn. It cleaned up 5 different culverts along this stretch of road so that they wouldn't blow out the road every time there's a big rain event. And it created a bunch of wetland habitat and good hunting access and fishing access for the people in Morgan. So it's like, again, we talk about stackable benefits and we think about things where we get those multiple things at once. And we think about that as like, that's how we think we can innovate. That's how we think we can enhance what we already do, is by taking a more collaborative approach and thinking more about how to find communities where there's a lot of people already working together, or places where people could work together and we can help them and help facilitate that. So as we put it together, so again, we did an inventory. We counted up what's conserved. We heard from a lot of Vermonters. We thought about how that was reflected. How could we approach the legislature's questions? And what we put out last summer, and we've kind of been working from ever since, is to organize our plan under 3 objectives. So the first objective we've already talked a little bit about, and I'll say more in a minute, but that's using Vermont conservation design, the science framework that identifies the places on the landscape that are most important for its function and health. So conservation design is sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes people think it's a plan to conserve or to regulate places, but it just says these are the places that are important for ecological health. And then it also says you could use a lot of different strategies to protect these places, including just people taking care of them voluntarily. But you could conserve them. They could be a use value appraisal. They could be protected by zoning or environmental regulations. But these are the important forests. These are the important connectivity corridors. These are important riparian corridors. These are the places that, the bogs and special natural communities that we like to visit. So that's the first thing, is let's center that in the work. The legislature really is focused on that. They really wanted to make sure that we're bringing ecological, focus and kind of real exact science and measurement and data to the work. The second thing that we sort of approach was, okay, how do we better connect communities to conservation? So there's already a lot of initiatives and plans in Vermont, and arguably we didn't need another one. So we tried to say, how can this plan support the things that are already happening? So if people there's a food security roadmap in Vermont that calls for more protection of farmland. So how do we fit into that by helping to conserve farmland? And there's a Move Forward Together Vermont. It's the comprehensive outdoor recreation plan for Vermont. And it starts with protecting the places where we go to recreate, funny enough. And the Forest Future Roadmap starts with protecting the forests. So one of our questions is, how do we better connect and uplift those works so that we're doing conservation in service of these areas of our work that people have already started working on, and they've already thought through the connection from like land protection to the kinds of entities and enterprises that are connected to it, to viability of those enterprises. Protecting a forest in order to make sure we protect the kind of silvicultural and logging and forestry community depends on a lot of things that we're missing right now, like mills and transport and better systems for processing. So, but that's not the conservation plan. That's the Forest Future Roadmap. We just want to connect into it in a way that uplifts that. There's also been a lot of work in Vermont in the last 10 years to really to think through better access for people. How do we protect or create access to smaller farms and enable people to be able to afford to be working in the working landscape. And so connecting to that again is that how can we do conservation for communities and community groups and collectives of people who want to access and have sort of a different relationship to productivity and living on the land. There's a number of different initiatives, and you'll see those in the plan. And then strengthening conservation capacity is sort of the last major theme, which is, this is a system that if you permanently conserve land, if you permanently protect it, it means you're also agreeing to permanently care for it. And so that's actually much more, in some ways, much more expensive and a much more important investment to think about as we do conservation is how are we going to steward and manage and restore those lands over time, and how can we do that sort of as nimbly and effectively and cost effectively as possible. So that's what the third objective really gets into is that we know we have some challenges ahead. So diving a little bit deeper again. Implementing the Vermont Conservation Design was that first objective.
Router's right there. Why can we not go through the wall? Oh.
You see it okay, Julie? Okay, so I don't know if that was a question for me, but we were looking at the Vermont Conservation Design. A&R really came up with, they did an analysis of what are the places in the conservation design that would be most important for permanent conservation. And I don't know why this is 1-1-1-1-1, but maybe these are all our most important priorities here. Anyways, but they really wanted to expand ecological representation, which means let's do some conservation in other places than the northern and southern greens and the high altitudes of the Northeast Kingdom. Can we do this in the other biophysical regions of Vermont? Can we really focus on connectivity, forest structure, aquatic systems, and then those rare natural communities? So that's objective one comes out of conservation design. Here's a deeper look at those other plans that I mentioned. Climate action plan, resilience strategy, a number of different outputs here, including the work of the Land Access and Opportunity Board, who's really helped VHCB to shape this plan. And really helped us to think about alternative ways to access land. But anyways, these are the initiatives that we want to coordinate with. And so they show up in objective 2. Right? So objective 2 is connecting to communities. And, again, all are night, we have to work on that slide because all 1-1-1-1-1 again. But we really want to increase access and viability for land-based enterprises, increase ecological management. We want to help to restore, landscapes, and we want to make sure that there's recreational access and educational access to the landscape. Putney Garden, by the way, cool project in the Southeast, which is when we talk about biodiversity, we talk about it everywhere, downtowns included. And this is affordable housing project in the background, but it's a pollinator garden and community garden that brings kind of the Act 59 and the thoughts about ecological connection right into downtown Putney. So again, thinking about this as creatively and expansively as possible. So moving towards objective 3, there's a lot of resource constraints, right? So right now there's the system is at capacity. Stewardship and long-term management of the lands that are already protected occupies a lot of the attention of the organizations like A&R or the Vermont Land Trust or Nature Conservancy or your local land trust, the South Hero Land Trust or Lake Champlain Land Trust operating up in your area. A lot of their effort and a lot of their funding goes to taking care of what's already protected. Also, the funding that was around in the early 2020s when we started working on 30 by 30 has sort of disappeared at the federal level. So there were 2 major federal bills, the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. And Congress had appropriated billions of dollars to support a whole set of initiatives related to landscapes and environmental health, but it included conservation and permanent land protection. And so that money has gone away. And then you all know, like just what's happening in Vermont right now is that land values and costs have gone up and up and up. So the value of an acre of farmland is more than it was 10 years ago by quite a big margin. And Vermont's not as bad as New Jersey or other places kind of near us, but $5,000 an acre is not that rare for a conservation deal to buy the development rights. So it's not a great time to say, can we hurry up and do more? It's actually a great time to say, can we collaborate more and can we work more to bring about outcomes that involve all of our partnerships in ways that are new and innovative. So that just, again, this is how we then think about the all our number one priorities here in Objective 3, which is aligning our business practices with these outcomes, building capacity around the state, expanding investments for not just A&R and VHCB, but for community organizations, and then bridging the gap for smaller parcels, driving local action and making it easier for us to legally to take care of what's conserved. So we could put more emphasis into the actions on the trails or in the forest that really take care of the land. So that's kind of the run through that we wanted to give. There's a few more slides here, but I just wanted to stop there and just see if there's, I don't know, Carrie and Oretta, if there's time, if anybody has any kind of technical questions or definitional questions or anything you'd like me to go back to. But yeah, I'll just pause for a minute here. Great photo of Mount Ascutney, a really fun project where the New York Times said it was the town that saved the mountain and the mountain that saved the town. And it was all around an acquisition of that by the community to recreate the trails and ski access, but also to fix the village store and to kind of increase the vitality of their downtown. So anyways, it wasn't exactly innovative, I don't think, but it was definitely it was a new kind of partnership that we had never seen before, where it was actually like the first person that talked to us was the owner of the general store, who said, I've got a theory about why I'm going out of business. And lo and behold, it had to do with this beautiful natural resource that's right there in the community. Anyways, I'll stop prattling at you and see if I get if you had any questions.
Was there a margin of error in the count that got to 27?
Did you hear that, Craig?
Yeah, the question I heard was whether there's a margin of error in determining the count. I'll go back to that slide so that people can see it here. Sorry for that doesn't give anybody like car sickness. So I think there's probably a little bit of a rough edge of on any particular parcel, we're using GIS data to mark the boundaries and to do that. So I think there's probably always a little bit of margin for error when you're not like actually walking a boundary and measuring it. And the maps that we have online don't always match what's on the ground. My family and I moved to Calais recently and bought an old farm that we're trying to restore, and we thought we'd bought so many acres, but then when we were trying to do a boundary survey because the town forest abuts us, and we found out that there was 15 more acres that had always been there that nobody had ever counted. So that wasn't great for our tax bill, but it did allow us to enroll the land in current use. So it was sort of helpful. But anyways, I think there's a lot of that potential, I think, for margin of error out there when we have all these different mapping systems and GIS tools. And then the other thing the two more points about margin for error here is that there are about 45,000 acres that are conserved, but don't really fit into the ACT scheme for ecological connectivity and community resilience. Is that Holly getting there?
Yeah.
Hey, Holly. An argument could be made for any of those parcels, and we've heard some interesting arguments. Like, for example, the firing range, Ethan Allen firing range, is thousands of acres, just a little bit south of you all. We didn't include it in this count because it's not really being managed for any of the values that the acts put forward, that the legislature put forward. So it's not an ecological reserve area that's being kind of left alone for ecological purposes. It's not a particular habitat that's being protected, and it's definitely not a working forest or farm. So there may be a few more acres there. And then how you treat, different people have had different feelings about how to treat that 170,000 acres of permanently conserved agricultural and open land. That's the parts of farms that are that have annual crops and that are open as meadows. So it's not, anybody who knows Vermont farms knows that many of them are more than half woods and wetlands and streams. And so it's it's not counting those acres. Those acres are counted as forest land and natural cover. So a conserved farm might be designating into two separate areas. But some people feel like those places where annual crops are produced shouldn't be counted. That wasn't VHCB's recommendation or ANR's. We work with the agency and we recommended that there are very strong arguments for why managed farmland is still contributing to ecological biodiversity and why it's definitely contributing to community resilience. And also, if it's permanently conserved, that means you have forever to kind of think about the best practices and connections to water and things like that. So, some of the activities on the land have an impact on the land or waters, but there's other ways that we protect them, and we can keep working on those. So our theory was count those. But some people might say, hey, by my count, I don't think you have that 2.91%. And some people might say, yeah, Ethan Allen firing range, there's a lot of deer running through there. Isn't that promoting wildlife passage? Shouldn't you count that? So I guess some arguments could be made either way.
Thanks, Trey. We also had another comment and question in the chat. Can you touch on the schedule for the eventual finalization of the plan? How would it be finalized / adopted?
So that's a great question, and it allows me to say something that's really important, which is that we're not a rulemaking body at VHCB, and we're not an appropriative body. We're not the legislature, and we're not a state agency. We're a quasi-governmental entity that has certain powers and authorities. We don't have the power to enact this plan. So what we're doing by June 30th, we're going to give the legislature a consolidated set of recommendations that focuses around this core framework that you all hopefully have had a chance to look at. That is what we're talking about tonight, the objectives and pathways and actions that are kind of at the core of a plan. Some of those things are priorities that we can do right away because they're urgent. We already have the capacity and funding to do them, and partners and communities are ready to get going. For example, we don't need to probably wait around after we make these recommendations to say, let's take a good hard look at VHCB's guidelines and policies and see if we can better align them with what's going on, like what the spirit of what we're recommending here, especially these innovations and things we want to do to give greater access. Can we move that forward right away? So that's something that we can do right away. Some things in the plan or the recommendations will require more authorization or funding, and those pieces will have to be authorized or funded by the legislature. So it's going to be a comprehensive implementation schedule that probably will look like its own sort of different initiatives that go forward. And so each of those will be on its own sort of timeline. We'll have its own stakeholders, its own conversations. And I know that makes it sound too complicated, but it's sort of like what we're imagining is like, this is a plan of action. And at the end of it, it launches 25 ships that all start to move forward kind of synchronously, but then one of them is going to one destination, which is better aligning our conservation practices with outdoor recreation. And that's going to get kind of taken up by communities and outdoor recreation organizations. And there's a set of recommendations there that will kind of follow their own track. And if they need more funding or more authorization, the legislature would be involved. Other pieces of this can just get moving right away. So we think of the implementation timeline as being 2030 to 50.
Great. We have one more question in the chat, but I'm wondering if you maybe want to work through those last couple of slides, and then we can really dive into the questions and conversation. Keith.
Absolutely. So I think the next slide where I stopped was allowing us to get to group introductions.
Great.
And then
if that's what's next up, then I might throw this question at you.
Okay, good. I'll pause here at Mount Escutney again.
Great. So we had a question: how much of the state's prime farmland has been conserved, and how is the remaining prime farmland treated in the plan?
That's another great question. I don't know the answer in terms of like acres of primary agricultural soils or statewide soils. I don't have that at my fingertips, but here's what I can tell you is that the 2.91% of agriculture and open land that conserved is about 1/4 of the farmland in Vermont. Or rather that conserved farms represent about 25% of farmland. Now, not all farmland that's conserved is all primary ag soils, and not all of it outside of conservation is primary ag soils. But the way that those are treated is that, the plan does not specify or name particular parcels or say we want to conserve this person's land or that person's land. Conservation is a voluntary action by a landowner. So we're not designating those other farms, but we are trying to increase the resources and the understanding of how conservation can help landowners to appeal to people. We definitely align with the Natural Resource Conservation Service at the United States Department of Agriculture that funds some of our work, and they're really interested in the health of soils on the farms that we protect. So that's one of the major factors that they look into to bring funding to Vermont for farmland conservation. That's through they have a program, again, through the Natural Resource Conservation Service that we match state dollars 1-to-1, or we pay 50% of the cost of farm conservation, but really hoping that the farms that we'll have will be, lots of primary agricultural soils. Other factors, access to markets, good infrastructure, or, often it's a time of a family intergenerational transfer or somebody new coming into operate. So those are some of the things NRCS is looking to optimize through its funding. But there's not a plan per se for any particular parcel out there other than understanding how it fits into VCD and what the different options that might be available for any landowner. Because there's a lot of non-permanent programs that landowners can access that, like use value appraisal or what people call current use, which is helps farms. There's different kinds of practices that you can get on a non-conserved farm, carbon contracts for forests. So there's a lot of stuff out there that those non-conserved farms could access, and I guess we would like to help people access that as well. So that's be another way we're thinking about the unconserved farmland is you don't have to conserve. Here are some other things you could do if you're interested.
Alrighty, thank you. It looks like we're maybe having some sound issues. I would say we can hear you loud and clear. Trey, maybe if folks can't hear, they want to leave and then rejoin the meeting. But
you want me to leave and join?
No. Just folks, if someone's having a sound issue, it might just need to be like a power off kind of moment. So if they rejoin, the sound might be better. But Trey, you're all good. Great. Thanks for those answers, Trey. We can move to the little quick introductions. We want to take some time for us to meet one another before we really dive into more of the conversation of this event. And I'm going to have Arena just drop these pieces in the chat. We would love for folks to, in 1 to 2 sentences, briefly share their name, what town they live in, why they're here tonight, and if applicable, what group or organization are you with? And it'd be great if we could start off here in the room, and then we'll pass it to the virtual room.
Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Kalikas. I live in Montgomery, Vermont. I am on the Montgomery Conservation Commission, and obviously very interested to see how this plan, or how Montgomery and the Conservation Commission can help, effectuate this plan or implement this plan.
Oh, I'm Ben Maddox, and I'm at the Enosburg Conservation Commission, and I have a store and shop on Main Street in Enosburg, and I have underwater movie series about Vermont, so like and subscribe. Called Icy Fishing. But I'm here for the Enosburg Conservation and for myself on some things that I'm going to say.
Sounds great. I want to look that up. Holly McClintock. I live in St. Albans. I am the ag coordinator at VHCB. So I love farms. I'm here for farms and for VHCB.
Brennan Brand. I'm a community engagement specialist at Franklin County NRCD. I live in Burlington, and I'm really glad to be here with you all, learning more about this plan and how our organization can also help be a connector and help in the implementation of it.
Great, thank you all. Again, I'm Carrie Brosnan, and I'm with the Franklin County NRCD. I am just going to call on some names to share, and I'll start with Emily Alger.
Hey, I'm Emily Alger. I work with the Center for Whole Communities, and we are showing up as listening partners with BHCB and the Land Access and Opportunity Board in a bunch of these meetings around the state. Thanks for having me.
Ken.
Oh, hi, Ken Mink, Georgia, Vermont. I was a Conservation Commission member for over 30 years, and we conserved a parcel with VLT and the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. Currently, I'm on BWQC for Basin 7, the Lamoille.
Sarah Downs.
Hi, I'm Enosburg Conservation Commission and also on the Missisquoi Basin Water Quality Council.
Great. Thomas.
Hi there. I'm with the Georgia Conservation Commission, and I've worked with Ken quite a bit at the Silver Lake Woods, and interested. I've been thrilled to hear about the program and looking forward to implementing it in the town of Georgia.
Great. Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Wright. Enosburg is very well represented. I'm on the Conservation Commission, also an alternate board member for Franklin County NRCD. Love farms, love seeing how everything in our state is interconnected, so we can preserve our beauty and have a wonderful place to live.
Awesome. Wendy.
Hi, Wendy Scott, also from Enosburg, also on the Enosburg Conservation Commission. And I am also a board member for MRBA and Upper Missisquoi and Trout Wild and Scenic. I'm just really interested in this whole program, and for our land, we have 40 acres, beautiful acres, right in the Cold Hollow Mountain area. And it's not enough to conserve, but I just love to find out what other things I could do to protect our land.
Awesome. Walter.
Hi there, I'm Walter. I've been on an associate board member for the Franklin County NRDC for maybe a couple months, and I've just been kind of learning about the work that they do, and so this is just me kind of participating in one of the meetings, hoping to learn a little bit about the conservation plan. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to call on some folks who don't have their video on, and if I don't hear a response, totally fine. We can pass over. But oh, yay, some videos turned on. Vicky.
Hi, Carrie, Marina, everybody. I'm Vicki Drew. I sit on the board of directors for the Franklin County Natural Resource Conservation District, as well as Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, and on the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts. I live in Georgia, Vermont. In my past life, I was the state conservationist for NRCS in Vermont and worked a lot of time and energy on conservation easement programs throughout the state. Thanks.
Awesome. Dean?
Hi, sorry for the slow mic, Carrie. Dean Pierce, I work at the Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and I guess I wish I could claim some connection to Enosburg other than having a telephone number that's a 933. Regional Planning Commission is based in St. Albans. I mostly do water quality work, but have a farm background in Franklin County.
Joan?
Hi, I'm Joan Hildreth and my husband been overeating some chips on the side, but anyway, I'm on the Montgomery Conservation Commission and am interested in learning about more of this. Thank you.
Scott?
I'm unlike everyone else here. I'm just a random citizen. I live in Fletcher. I recently learned of a project from the Trust for Public Land in the Fletcher area to preserve 1,400 acres. What got me interested in that is just the possibility of adding maybe mountain bike trails and maybe some backcountry skiing. Our region, Franklin County, kind of has a lack of those things, in my opinion. So I'm hoping that some of this, and through that, I learned about this program, this 30 for 30 program. So I just kind of became interested in what opportunities are out there to preserve land, and hopefully those preservations might lead to some additional recreation opportunities.
Great. Carolyn? Oh, you might be muted still. There you go.
Hi, yeah, Carolyn Bronze. I'm on the Bakersfield Conservation Commission, and I think I'm also interested in that, in the Lost Nation project, which Bakersfield has a little corner of, and just interested to find out more about this plan.
Great. Thank you. I think Megan and Cindy, yeah, Megan, if you want to share.
Sure. Sorry. I look like I'm in the dark here. My name is Megan. I'm in Georgia and I'm a new member, or technically alternate, on the Georgia Conservation Commission. So I'm just trying to get up to speed on all things in the local and state level having to do with conservation. So thanks for having this.
And Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm from Montgomery, and I'm just here to listen and learn.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thanks for doing that, everyone. It's nice to see all your faces and hear where we're all coming from today. So the next portion is diving into some of the questions that you all may have. And Trey, I don't know if you want to share that like slide of questions that we came up with, just to prompt the conversation, and we can also maybe copy and paste those questions and put them in the chat too.
Sorry, once I started sharing, and then my mute button disappeared. So anyways, yeah. So I have had a really fun time meeting Carrie and Arena over the last couple of weeks. This is exactly what we had in mind when we decided that we wanted to try and help to facilitate these, and we called for proposals, and 28 different organizations have stepped forward, like Franklin County NRCD, to do this. And it's been, for one thing, getting to meet people all over Vermont is great, but also getting to meet the people who host has been great. So thank you both for this. These are questions that the three of us really, I've been reflecting a lot and hearing a lot, and Emily and our friends at CWC and at the Land Access Opportunity Board and our partners at ANR, we've been starting to like categorize and think, what are we hearing? What keeps coming up? And one of the things that we thought would be interesting for this group is to really think about small community-based organizations and the resources they need to, if you support the goals and the concept of 30 by 30, it's increasing not just the pace of our work, but the vision, the quality and impact of it. So what do folks need to do that? A community-based organization could be a conservation commission, a conservation district, a small land trust, the municipality's select board. So it could be like a community land trust. So there's a lot of different, ways that can work. Really honestly, we can fund 501c3s and municipalities. So if they're connected to our work, that's what we're talking about. So how can we break down the barriers? Somebody talked about 40 acres and said, I can't can't conserve because I'm only on 40 acres, and that's similar for my family. And but we've heard that from a lot of people, and maybe 40 is too small, but there's a lot of people who would like to work with Vermont Land Trust or their local trust, and are told that it's too small at 100 or 150 or 200. So if we can get those smaller organizations, then maybe we can work with smaller landowners, and that's really the second question. How do we break into that work with people who are really interested, but and maybe they don't want to permanently conserve, maybe they want to do other things. And that gets into the third question here is, and we've certainly heard from a lot of people who say either I'm not sure that my land is right for conservation, or I'm not sure I'm right for conservation, or conservation's right for me. I sure don't want to hamper my children and constrain their choices because this is permanent. So thinking about the other programs that are out there and how can our plan integrate those so that it's like, yeah, you can do an easement. The town can buy this forest. The 1,400 acres sounds wonderful for community access, that mountain biking and skiing and just immersion in nature that you were talking about. I can't remember who it was on there, but that sounded wonderful. But it may just be that for some landowners, use value appraisal is enough, and or a CREP contract to take care of the streams on their farm, or a contract that for 20 years you manage your forest to be a little bit more protective and a little bit less boards and cords, and the carbon sequestration is getting paid for. So those options are out there too, and communities can think about zoning, and they can think about overlays, and there are other regulatory things going on out, like the wetlands rules definitely protect class 1 and 2 wetlands in Vermont. So there's a lot of other programs out there we need to be connected to. And then I guess the last question is like, if those small community orgs are thinking about supporting people at that smaller parcel level, thinking about supporting them across the span of programs, how do we make sure that there's enough like feasibility funding and technical assistance and also access to data and science and tools? So this is a kind of a sticky wicket in the conservation system, if you will. And we're really curious what people's experiences have been, what your ideas are, what your thoughts are. A lot of conservation commissions here tonight, a lot of people interested in farmland protection. What's going on, and what do your cousins tell you from upstate New York, and what have you always wanted to try at your conservation commission but been afraid to ask? That's all sort of fair game. And Carrie and Arena, I'll turn it back to you to lead the conversation, and also to let should I keep the share up, or is this in the chat?
It's in the chat now, so I think it would be good to maybe you can take the questions down because it'd be nice to see everyone's face, and we'll make sure that that's big enough for us here. All right.
I do see a question from Ken, but I wonder if we should address that now or really dive into discussion.
The answer is yes. They're all permanently conserved. The 27%.
Great. Does anybody have any thoughts on these prompts here? Can't see them.
No, it's okay.
Oh, here.
What is the minimum amount of acreage that is required to be conserved or considered conservation?
I'm not aware that any organization has kind of like a posted minimum. But we do hear anecdotally that it's hard to work with like the Vermont Land Trust or the Nature Conservancy if it's not a couple hundred acres or connected to existing conserved land. So we certainly do a lot of conservation of small parcels where it's like a 10-acre parcel that gives access to a state forest or something. So depending upon the characteristics of the parcel, it can be quite small. But I think what often is the consideration is just how much the stewardship is going to cost for that, and how many more small parcels can a land trust take on and be able to maintain relationships with all those landowners forever, which is what conservation in perpetuity means. So that's I think how the calculus that they go through. But I mean, in some places, a half acre is critical. Ask the people in Waterbury about the places that got conserved and then restored to restore wetland and connectivity, and that made the 2023 flood a lot less bad for Waterbury than Irene was. So a half acre somewhere can make a huge difference.
Thank you.
And I wonder if, because I don't know exactly how familiar each individual person here is with the draft plan so far, it actually might be helpful to, I don't know if you have some of those
to review some of those little snippets.
Because the way that the plan is structured, and maybe Trey, you can talk a little bit more about this in detail, is that there are actions associated with each of the objectives, or pathways rather, and then there are sub-actions which call out to different organizations and agencies to be people to implement those actions. And so conservation commissions and other small conservation organizations are often the ones being called out in those sub-actions, where it says like, hey, we need you as an organization to be a partner in increasing conservation of smaller parcels, for example, or increasing education about conservation. So it might be helpful to review some of those call outs before we dive into these questions. And maybe Trey, you can kind of riff on that a little bit.
We even put together a few slides that kind of show some questions that, would that be good, Irena? Is that what you're thinking, to kind of?
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah.
If that would help.
So, all right, I'll share again here. This is really, for one thing, please ask questions if things are unclear. We've been working on this for three years, and it's a lot of it is like, learning about decades of work from organizations. And I know there are a lot of professional conservationists or volunteer conservationists here today, but if it doesn't sound clear, just let us know. So we go back to just quickly here, the idea that there's, the plan is organized under these three objectives. Objective one has a set of kind of strategic, look at it again. So objective one was implementing Vermont conservation design. I'm pointing to it here on my other screen as if you can see me, but that's probably not very helpful. But anyways, in that, the pathways are expanding ecological representation, protecting connectivity corridors, improving forest structure, et cetera. And then there's like really specific measurable actions under each of those. So I'm going to, hopefully again, without making this too difficult to follow, I'm going to fast forward here to, all right, so we're talking about objective one. So in that centering Vermont conservation design, there's an action that's embedded in how we do this. It says, encourage municipal and regional land use planning that supports connectivity. And the sub-actions are really trying to ensure landscape benefits through connectivity and giving on-the-ground organizations the tools and the funding and the support to really identify those connectivity corridors that are on individual pieces of land or that are affected by watershed groups or municipalities or conservation commissions. So how do we get from like planning at that holistic level down to like individual parcels? And Dean's here, and he's part of a clean water service provider program doing water quality work, and VHCB does that work as well up in the Northeast Kingdom. And so I think about that, like that slide I showed you before with Morgan Brook, where we did stream restoration and connectivity. How can local organizations get involved in that kind of work is really what these objectives and actions are getting at. So one, how do we create a master plan for a community of what's most important and actionable, especially around ecological connectivity? Because ecological connectivity is like, that's the most, like from an ecology standpoint, that's what climate change response is all about, is finding a way for systems to connect so that not only fauna, but flora can move over time. That our forests are going to march north like the Ents in Lord of the Rings over the next 100 years. And they need to go kind of tree to root to tree to root. We're not going to give them a lift. So they need to be connected all through. So it's easy to show that on a map. how do we dial that all the way down to those groups that are mentioned here, individual landowners, watershed groups, municipalities, and conservation commissions? And if we're thinking about connectivity along a stream, how many different landowners might we be talking about? And how many different strategies are going to be needed to appeal to them? So this is, I guess what this is asking is, how could somebody at the planning commission level or at the conservation district level take a bird's eye view, or you all, a lot of you are in the kind of cold hollow to Canada connectivity area. So they also have that big picture view, but translate it down to individual actions. And because conservation is, it depends on the landowner. Some people might want to conserve because they're part of that, and some people might not. So how do we, my question to you all, or I guess what we want to, is this realistic? Can we bridge the gap between that planning level and that action level in a coordinated way? And here's the kicker, in a system that depends, that's a voluntary system. Because this is not, we can't just come to your house and say, tag, you're conserved. So.
Any thoughts from participants?
Can I go?
Yes, yeah, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, you know, one as I've learned about this, as a member of the Edithsburg Conservation Commission, you know, I have to sell this, right? And there's some, and in order to make that answer to your question, in order to make this real, it has to be sellable. Like you said, people have to want to participate in it. And in my research about it, or learning about it, and passing it around to my zoning administrator, my village manager, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of like red flaggy that people they immediately are like, what? And one of the big whats is I think 4 separate times in there we're asked to like triple the spending and double the spending, and we're supposed to give the money to the private organizations like Vermont Land Trust. And so I'd say, and I'm familiar with Vermont Land Trust. I even advocated to give them Enosburg's money. But the more you look at it, or I went and said like, well, who is this? And so I just, here's some quick Vermont Land Trust facts. So $7 million. They are the richest state level land trust in the United States, even though we're like small and poor. So their budget is way bigger than the Enosburg municipal budget. Their total holdings, which I know they can't liquefy this, but their total holdings are bigger than all the budgets of our Franklin County towns together. So it's an immensely powerful organization. So I said, well, what is this democratic? You know, is this, because people say, well, we're going to give up a 30 to 50%, and a huge percent of this is going to go to these private organizations. And so I said, there's no public minutes of their trustees meetings. They just recently had a big accounting ding against them because they just bumped up their funds by $20 million in 1 year. And this is part of like, well, what could go wrong, right? Which the plan did not have what could go wrong. Let's do risk assessment. And what could go wrong is for the land trust. It's very disconnected from Vermont. It's funded by the Marshall Foundation. There's some people, and I know people in Vermont voluntarily give their land to them. But it's, the trustees, 2 of them don't live in Vermont. One of the trustees just received like $15 million from Amazon. So it's like, who is going to be your forever overlords for your local community? Well, Vermont Land Trust. And a lot of people will balk at that. And so that's a sales problem. And, so another sales problem that's hard to sell is that on the TAC, that there's 4 trust members who are, and I asked for ethical guidance from the state on this, so which is the service that they provide to conservation commissions. And I'll just read a quick thing, because I sent this. I haven't heard back from them. Although I did So does drafting standards that govern their employees' future revenue streams constitute an appearance, a conflict of interest? So on the TAC of this plan, you've got Vermont Land Trust, Tracy, I don't know how to standards, Shelby Sims, Trust for Public Land Priorities, Jamie Fidel, Audubon, he's standards. And so these people are giving themselves money. I mean, like I don't want to and I want to wait for the guidance, but to me, that's an appearance of conflict of interest. And it also is kind of undemocratic in a way, like you bypassing our select boards, our local planning commissions, and just like now these trusts and these people have so much power and so much money. And another hard sell is the obvious question of where's the tax money going to come from when 50% of the land. So if you want to have our education tax system, everybody knows how it works. You fund the schools based on taxing land. And if 50% of the land or a huge percentage of the land gets moved into untaxable status or less taxable status, because even current use, you get something out of it, then this is part of the risk assessment. You guys use Future IQ to reach out. They say they make extreme. What is there a risk assessment to our education system? Deb, is anybody on the plan try to work that out for societal impacts for us? And that's basically all that's it.
There was kind of like three pieces to that, Trey. I don't know if you want to take it one at a time.
I can.
Yeah.
If you ask me.
Those are great questions. I mean, thank you for coming with good, hard questions. This is, I may need some help thinking back to all three of the pieces, Carrie, but, I guess I'd say one thing that we have heard a lot of is that the system of very large players has done a lot of work, but the future depends on not defining the system as closed and only inclusive of those people going forward. And that's why this question is sort of set up like it is, and that's why our objective 2 is sort of set up like it is to really focus on having collaborating with new partners and expanding beyond sort of what we do now, enhancing what we do and doing more and different. So that's been we work a lot with the Vermont Land Trust. They do a lot of good conservation work. They do have large holdings. They have more burden in terms of stewardship and management than any other land trust in the country, as you said. It's some of those easements may seem like assets, or those ownerships may seem like assets, but it's also I do know some of the trustees and the people who work there, and I know they work really hard to manage it within the values and the goals of the organization too. So it's not a for-profit entity, and none of those people are, taking a profit out of it. It's organized for a specific kind of mission. So, but it's not here to defend them or close off questions about that. I think those are fair questions to ask of VHCB, who works with them, and of them as well. But I would rather emphasize too that we know that they're kind of maxed out in terms of their capacity to do a whole lot more. They want to steward better and have better relationships and do more to take care of the land that's already protected through their investments. And so we're asking, who else wants to step up? How do local, you mentioned your select boards and others, how do local get people involved? And our TAC did include some members of those larger organizations, and it also included people who are tapped into regional planning and municipal government and local conservation commission. So we were trying to hear it from a number of different perspectives, and I would say that it's not a full consensus thing, but that just doing business as usual and not working with the towns is not a good option. Or rather to say that a key strategy going forward is figuring out, like this slide says, how to work with the local watershed groups and local conservation commissions.
Can I slip in my quick Nirvana quote for you? This sums it up. Forever in debt to your priceless advice. And that's what part of that Vermonters will be forever in debt to the priceless expertise of the land trust.
Perhaps.
We're all dead. We'll be in debt to that.
Yeah, that's a great Kurt Cobain lyric.
I only understood what he said like a year ago. I was like, oh, he's saying that.
I could never. My family makes fun of me because I always sing the wrong lyrics, especially for Nirvana songs. So I was singing the wrong lyrics for that for 20 years probably. Anyways, I guess this question of taxation comes up a lot, and it is accurate that if the state acquires a parcel, it's not going to pay taxes on that. But it does make a payment in lieu of taxes to communities if it takes ownership of a parcel. It's accurate that if a municipal town forest is created, that it usually doesn't tax itself. But otherwise, just the act of conserving a parcel doesn't take it out of taxation. If I gave an easement on my 40 acres to the town or to the local land trust, the listers probably aren't going to assess my like forest and fields and wetlands any differently and callous, and my tax rate is not likely to go down. So there's not a strong link between easements and loss of tax revenues the way that people sometimes fear. And likewise, we're not talking about preservation of 50% of the state. In fact, we're talking about protecting unmanaged areas as a very small portion of conservation. We want most of the land that's protected to be land that people are that there's working farms, working forests, places we access for recreation, places we access for education, places that we access for silviculture, recreation, resilience, stuff that helps to protect our downtown. So thinking about ways that there can be economic drivers in this. That's why we talk about Kingdom Trails and East Burke, because they use conservation to protect land, to drive locally loved recreation that also contributes a huge amount of sort of local sales tax and revenue to the community. But these considerations are really important. That's why, perpetual conservation has to be important. It has to be something that communities want to do, not just doing it for numbers. I hope that's sort of the spirit of those questions. And if there's something I missed, I'd be happy to.
No, thank you, man. Thank you. That's excellent.
I don't know if anybody else who's here wants to respond to any of that too. I know some things, but you all know a lot of things too. So that's probably a Kurt Cobain line too.
I see Ken has his hand up. Ken, yeah. Oh, I think you just muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so are state-owned lands considered conserved? Is one question.
Yes. If they are, there's some state-owned lands like rights of way or state buildings and parking lots, but state-owned forests owned by A&R and wildlife management areas and river corridor lands that the state owns are considered to be conserved. So are the U.S. Forest Service lands.
Trey, are they shown could you bring up that list again?
Yeah. They're counted here, but they're not. You'd have to go online to BioFinder where you can look at a map of Vermont in any parcel and you can see how it's categorized as ecological reserve, biodiversity conservation area, forest and natural, or ag and open. So you can go on and see how they fit in there, and then you can see if it's private, federal, or state. So there's a way to kind of look at on BioFinder. And I'm sorry, I should have put a slide on for that, but that's maybe something Carrie and Arena and I can follow up if people are interested in the GIS. But yeah, you can look on a state block and see like the Howe block in the Moortown area and see how it's sort of how that unit is being treated and considered here as probably a mix of ecological reserve and forest land and natural cover.
I mean, I'm surprised you don't have a standalone category of state-owned lands. What I'm hearing you say is they're integrated in those 6 areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and we know, I mean, they're all marked on the map and we know where they all are. The inventory we were asked for was to divide it up into these four categories but we did track on the biofinder whether is it a conserved ecological reserve area, and is it privately owned, publicly owned by the state or by the U.S. Forest Service or by a municipality. So it's sort of it's tracked, but it wasn't necessarily the exact focus of the legislature in the inventory.
But I mean, the state lands, they're not conserved like to a land trust. It's a different animal, isn't it, Trey?
Well, fee ownership of lands by a conserving organization is considered conservation, sort of across the country. That's sort of the two practices that you see in a lot of states are either fee ownership by a conservation org or the ownership of an easement and the stewardship of that by a conservation org. But it's different, for sure. State ownership is really different, and there are a lot of different considerations than if I donated an easement to my local land trust, who's now managing a relationship with me as a private owner. The other thing I would mention is that actually a lot of state-owned lands also carry an easement, but not all of them do. So there's a percentage of state forest and wildlife management areas that are owned by the state, but there's no conservation organization with an easement over that land. And there are proponents and opponents of having that, depending on who you ask.
So Trey, Green Mountain, the national forest is included in these numbers?
Yes.
Wow.
You're wow because Congress could take action on that, or what were you thinking, Ken?
Well, how close are we to 30% is my question. Now,
47.
Well, our math is that we're about 190,000 acres away. But that's including a mix of federally owned lands, state-owned lands, and eased lands.
Okay.
Ken, do you have any follow-up to that? Or I might.
Well, just from the town of Georgia redid their plan in 2025, and I lobbied for some stronger language to implement the 30 by 30 program, and all they did was include 2 sentences about Act 59. It's just it's just not going to happen. Just because a lot of towns don't have the initiative.
I think there's a set of towns, Ken, that have a commission.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those commissions also have an annual budget that's usually pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
My town, I'm on my local Calais Conservation Commission, and we have an $8,000 a year budget, which is actually pretty big. And sometimes we build that up. Sometimes we give a local match to a conservation project, but we mostly use that to publish a newsletter about our streams and lakes and do a bunch of Phragmites control projects. So we're not doing a lot of conservation, but what I've been asking my conservation commission about is would we be interested in working with the Vermont Conservation Design Maps of Calais and as a commission talking, not as a state agency, but as neighbors talking to people to here's all these streams that run down from Robinson Hill to the Winooski. You can follow those, all the parcels they cross. How do we best protect those and work together as landowners to do that? And could the commission do something to facilitate that? And what if the commission could get some funding from VHCB to accept donated easements of that VHCB would co-hold with the town? Could we do that? Maybe, maybe not. Most towns would say we probably need a full-time person or a half-time person if we're going to start doing that. And so capacity ends up being a gate. But that's the question we're asking, and that when that slide a couple minutes ago that didn't generate a lot of conversation right out of the gates, but like what would it take to unlock that for you and for your community?
Well,
Anyways, Vicky and Walter have been waiting for a second. I want to see if they've got answers for you, or for our first comment, or other things to say.
Mhm. Yeah, Vicky, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I don't think it had anything to do with Ken's comment, but Trey, I apologize. I haven't actually looked at the plan. But I'm curious whether or not at the local level, like in the town of Georgia or at the county level, Franklin County for the conservation district, is it prioritized so that have you shown where there's interconnection between prime farmland, habitat, connectivity issues so that, I go way back 20 years ago, 16, 17 years ago now, where the state had their wetlands conservation easement prioritized map 1, 2, 3, or however it was labeled. You probably remember that too, Trey, where really guided the work of NRCS. And I'm curious whether or not this map or this plan gives the same kind of guidance. So if a conservation commission is sitting down and saying, where should we start? Because it can seem overwhelming. These are our highest priority areas. Let's go talk to those landowners first and see what interest level is out there. So just curious about the prioritization setting of parcels.
I'm going to take the share down again so everybody can see each other. Remind me to go back and forth with that as we go here. It's nice to see you again, Vicky. We in acknowledgement, Vicky and I worked together a long time ago on water quality stuff, and it is nice to see a lot of old friends here. And so with this plan doesn't create any new scientific tools, but it kind of brings them in. So the one that it uplifts the most is the Vermont Conservation Design, which does, from a ecological perspective, it does exactly what you just asked. Is any community like Calais could print out the 12 different map views that conservation design has, and so you can see where in your community there are important interior forests and where the connecting blocks are between those, where the riparian corridors are, the special natural communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a really good, like a nationally recognized framework that Vermont ANR has put out there. There is not the exact same thing for ag. Although USDA has a soils map that we can look and we use to kind of understand where the really good soils are. We have other maps and some of our partners, and we talked about Vermont Land Trust, but I think they've curated for a while kind of like where are the major farm assets and farm communities and markets and that kind of thing. So that's something that we're thinking about. How do we produce that as a complement to this work as an initial action step? Is like, what's the priority? What's the Vermont conservation design for farmland? So that communities know these are the farms with the really great soils, the great infrastructure, the great water resources that could be protected through conservation, frankly, as well as access to markets and that sort of thing. But it is a little. We're still trying to figure out what all the parameters would be for such a map. But I think communities can. I think at the local level, a commission that had some resources and connection to some TA could probably figure that out at the town level. But the other thing I've heard, CDs are not well funded, despite how prosperous Cary and Arena look. That's not a part of our budget that's really well developed at the state level, even though it's one of the oldest parts of our state statutes to create a democratically, a system that's everywhere in the state. But they don't have a lot of extra money to focus on conservation planning at the local
I'm
level.
treasurer of the board, so I'm well aware, Trey.
Yeah. And the same with the regional planners. If Catherine were here, she'd say, well, we get a lot of money for clean water, but we don't get a lot of money for resource planning. And that's been bandied about quite a lot. Should the RPCs or the districts and it's one of the questions in our plan is who in each sort of regional to multi-county level is going to emerge as the person who leads that exercise.
It just feels really clunky right now with having to go to multiple maps to get a good, clear picture of priority areas. So
yeah.
Anyway, just my own observation and long-standing wish of how we'd all be able to operate. And, there's obviously huge challenges at the local level. My husband's sitting next to me. He was on the planning board for years in Georgia. And, the capacity of the local planning organizations and the development review boards is so stretched thin. And you have to have a willing select board, several of us from Georgia on this meeting. And, that's really where it starts, is the select board. So.
It does, which means outreach, education,
Right.
access to information,
Yes,
and like
voter education, voter outreach.
251 separate campaigns.
Yep. So anyway, I'll shut up.
No, Vicky, I appreciate it. This is one of the big questions we've heard, and we've heard this around the state is like, well, we've got good planners here, and we've got good local planners, and we've got our CD, but like, who's on first, who's on second? Should there be a local process to determine who's the kind of organizing entity? How do we make sure that everybody's then included? But welcome to Vermont. We have different maps for everything.
Good ones.
And so we're trying not to create too many new ones. But yeah.
Thank you,
Walter.
Hi. I really appreciate how this conversation has been going, and I think I don't have any answers, but I do have questions. I would say like as it relates to like what kind of resources, like building a pool of resources for small community-based organizations to do this, to maybe serve as an alternative to, as Ben was talking about, the Vermont Land Trust. Something I was curious about is, are there any case studies of like local organizations or towns or municipalities purchasing farmland that might be transferring out? Like you had mentioned before that a lot of these like movement into conservation like happens when like perhaps a farm owner is aging and their family might not want to take on the burden of maintaining that farm. And I'm wondering if like there have been any case studies that you know of where local organizations or municipalities have taken over those farms and used the resources that the revenue that might be generated by those farms to further conservation goals or goals of local, or the municipalities that might
Yeah.
I don't know, very specific.
That's good. No, that's a great question. I have heard of that in other countries where there's like programming to kind of like they tend to be Northern European countries that are have more socially owned infrastructure altogether, but where farms are sort of like owned and then sold and then reclaimed by the state, if you will. But we see a lot of town forests, and we see town access areas for water and those kinds of things, or easements for power infrastructure. But I'll get back to Carrie and Arena if there's a good model out there where a municipality has done that. But
yeah, MRBA and yeah. There's that example. And I actually went to a webinar last week on the history of town forests in Vermont that the Vermont Land Trust did put on for full transparency. And one cool thing that I learned is that, and I think Calais is actually the only example of this currently, that Calais uses revenue from timber harvest in its town forest to fund its conservation commission. And the revenue probably isn't like huge, and Trey, you probably know this because you're on the Conservation Commission. But that is
anymore, actually. But we're allowed to, yeah. But to Walter's point, can there be like, can these assets support? It's
like, why not?
There's a couple. I wouldn't want to focus on the why nots, although one why not is that it's really hard to farm and make a profit. So a community taking that on would be taking on a lot of risk. So that is something. But if you had the right community, but I have seen, we are aware of some like small like collectives who do that. So it's not the municipality, but like 8 landowners who buy a 300-acre parcel together and develop a portion of it, use a portion of it in agriculture, and the rest of it is stewarded for its natural resources and trails and that kind of thing. And like Cobb Hill down in sort of southeastern central Vermont is a good example of a kind of intentional community like that that's organized around a farm. And the Headwaters Community Trust in Greensboro is trying to like get moving on projects like that. And the Land Access Opportunity Board, which is a state board that really focuses on access to land, is also asking that question of how can we create more like alternative tenure models and ways to get people on the farm. But I don't know. We certainly, there are folks at the Agency of Ag who have asked how can we have more smaller farms in Vermont that are supported by communities and by the state. And so far we haven't seen a lot of that, Walter. We generally, even if like VHCB sometimes would acquire a farm temporarily, but we're looking to then find a farmer to get onto that farm right away. Usually, rather than holding it. But that would be interesting for our community to be able to do that and to think about it's like, how do you get your high schoolers and middle schoolers involved and like, collectively like utilize this asset?
I mean, and it could be a matter of just renting out the land to someone who wants to farm it too, was kind of what I was thinking.
Which Vermont Land Trust does do. So they, somebody pointed out they're bigger than some municipalities or than a lot of them. And so there are private organizations around the country who do that sort of thing, and then divest it later, or what have you.
I guess actually one other question, once again not bringing answers, is I really appreciated Ben's point about the Vermont Land Trust, and just I guess one part of his question that I'm not sure if I heard answered was just kind of like about accountability and like what kind of accountability structures exist to not knowing whether or not mistakes are being made or there is malfeasance or what have you. Like if that were to happen down the road, we're making this huge, people giving them their land are making a huge commitment to them. Like what kind of accountability structures are there to make sure that people don't do things that people do, right? Like I guess I'm not sure if you have the answer to that, but that was something that
well, that wasn't that I had said I wasn't sure if I got all of Ben's questions answered, and there are
that's part of what worlds are colliding. It's my best daily customer.
Oh,
Okay, I'll do
see you on Saturday.
Sorry, there's just some community connections going on. We love to see it.
Yeah, I was saying earlier, I think the only way forward is collaboration and new relationships. Yeah. So love that. In terms of to Walter and Ben's question, I think the Dean put something in the chat, which is that in a lot of cases, VHCB and or somebody else is an easement co-holder. So we're overseeing and there's checks and balances between two institutions. But if you don't trust institutions, that's not much help. But that's one answer is dividing up the responsibility among different institutions because of their, the size of their holdings. They have a fairly robust audit process that they have to, at least to get any public funding from us, we require that they show us all their financial books and their audits and how much cash is on hand and how many new employees, how many old employees. So when we fund anybody for, to do publicly funded work and to increase their capacity to do that, we take a very careful look at their books, and we do that over time. So we see that. So it's a very long relationship between the trust and VHCB that way before my time. But that relationship has evolved a habit of that kind of like openness. But then the other thing this is actually something that somebody's called out Shelby and Jamie, but two other people who are part of those larger statewide organizations had said, I think we need a system that we need some kind of an accountability, like almost like a governance audit of the conservation system. So there's a lot of conservation goes through public bodies, and they're accountable through their voters and what have you, in public records and open meeting law. But what is the accountability measure for all the money that goes to private organizations? And that's something we've been thinking about. How do we implement that recommendation? And you won't see it as one of the actions yet in the plan, because we've really struggled with how to do that, but to be able to have some insight into private organizations. At the end of the day, though, whether any of us likes it or not, our courts and our laws do protect certain rights for private organizations, and so the question would be whether we invest public money in them if we don't like what they're doing. I mean, I think that's ultimately the question, is if a VLT or another private organization is not behaving consistently with the values of Vermont, then the power of Vermont is the power of the purse, is to walk away from that financial relationship. And I don't, in VHCB's history with the VLT, that's never been really on the table. But there are there's well-founded reasons for people to be worried about corporations, and there's well-founded reasons for people to be worried about government. And this is not the whole state budget, but it's real money every year that we invest. And it comes out of the property transfer tax. So Vermonters are paying, and we're trying to return that money to communities. But if we're not doing it well, then that's money that's leaving communities and not coming back.
Yeah, I see, Sarah, you have your hand up. I do want to acknowledge Joan. I see your question in the chat, and I think that might be a good question to get to when we're getting close to wrapping things up. But let's go to Sarah first.
So, my husband and I just conserved land this summer, and it is a long, difficult process that without support, people aren't going to do it. And I'm also on the board at Cold Holiday Canada, and the support that Cold Holiday Canada gives, and I know Joan also did the same thing, is invaluable. So I think without that, you can't do it alone. If you are not, most people aren't going to make the time nor the effort. And particularly if you have questions like Ben brings up about the land trust, we felt comfortable about it. The contracts, that you spend a lot of time on contracts that you're reading, you're having your lawyer look at, so that you're protected, and then you're paying a lot of money to steward it, so that someone comes out every year to check out to make sure you're following what you're supposed to be doing. So that's one piece that, if you don't have support, I think it's really, really difficult. And we're very fortunate, as Trey said, with Cold Holiday Canada, and the way we have gotten a lot of land, as we have had two people who have looked at the state maps and had contacts and actually went out and talked to those landowners, spent a lot of time with them. And now we actually have a paid person. So it's increased, thank you. That is also partially, his salary is partially funded by the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. But it's really helped because he's there to, I want to say, hold your hand, not like a little kid, but the legalese, which agency you should look at, if you can get money for it, how to do it, what's out there. And if you're just on a planning commission or a conservation board, you have no idea where to start, how to do this. And you need someone that can walk you through it and support you. Because we went through the Vermont Land Trust, but it took probably a year for them to accept us. And, that was something, I felt really strongly about, but I think a lot of people would have walked away. And so unless you take some of those obstacles, and grease the wheels in some way. I don't see us making the goal.
That's a very valid concern, Sarah. But go ahead. I don't mean to cut you off. You were going to say
No,
something else.
I was done. I just think I look at this and go, I mean, we're trying to do 30 by 30 in our area. We may make it. We hope we will. But we've got incredible people working at that pretty diligently, putting a lot of time in. You know, a retired county forester that knows every parcel of land in the county and is connected to everybody. But most places don't have that.
No, it does tend to be a conspiracy of goodwill where it happens if especially if it happens in a way that people are leaned in and really satisfied with the results of it because it's a long-term process. You know, when we work with NRCS to do those farms I was talking about, like, you know, we had one farmer down in Waitsfield who went from being unmarried to having like, you know, a kid and then twins by the time we finished the deal. So like, you know, he went from being a bachelor to having 3 kids, including, you know, a set of twins. It takes a long time to work through all that machination. And that is hypothetically the value of the conserving organizations that work with landowners to educate them and to help them understand what they're doing and what the values are. And I do hear from trusts that also advise on other options, like Cold Hollow will advise on family carbon programs. Nature Conservancy advises people on current use enrollment and, you know, the options around ESTAs and reserve areas within the current use program. And so the different tools and strategies that are out there, I think that's what we want to have with those, but they just aren't. For one thing, VLT's at max, and for another thing, it's not everybody's cup of tea. So we are sort of wondering how to fit within that structure that includes some statewide and regional organizations, capacitated local organizations who have access to the data and tools, and maybe some simplified tools so that it doesn't take as long for some, like if we're trying to do work with municipalities, like, you know, an easement is an agreement and it can be as complicated as you want it to be or as uncomplicated. But when I look at very simple easement templates, there's not much there to prevent, you know, you start to walk away from saying, what's this being conserved for? Is it just being conserved so it can't be developed? Or are there other things that you're trying to do with the land to protect the health of the forest or the health of the farmland? And so they often add on both the list of musts and must nots, and they can get long and convoluted, but they could be quite simple, which is that don't develop it, like i.e. don't add impervious surface beyond a tiny, you know, de minimis amount, and don't do it for commercial purposes. Don't do a commercial harvest without a forestry plan, and don't farm without following the farming rules. There's a lot of protection just in that. I could put that all on one page, but I doubt I'd get our board to put $300,000 behind that on a big parcel of land because they'd say, who's going to enforce it? And what happens in 5 years when that landowner sells it? And, you know, all these questions that come in with stewardship and perpetuity. But anyways, that's Sarah, we are really thinking about that. How do we crack that nut? And again, how do local conservation commissions fit into that picture?
It's, you know, without support, most of the land that has been conserved in our area through Cold Hollow to Canada would not have happened. That's just point blank, you know, and so we're fortunate, but other communities aren't. And I know with Jones land, that was a hard one. Fantastic, because it was just at a window where they looked at, you know, it was not enough, but it had such incredible features. But without Cold Hollow helping her and her husband, that wouldn't happen. So in other towns, you're not going to see a lot going on unless you can get some boots on the ground to help people.
I think I saw Vicky nod her head earlier when I said it's hard to ask conservation commissions to do this when it's all volunteers.
Yeah.
Communities need dedicated capacity to participate.
Because it's only one part of our mission in a conservation commission. You have lots of things you're supposed to be doing. And I'll be quiet now.
Well, thank you for not being quiet for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, Joan, I see you came off camera. Do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I just echo what Sarah said about Cold Hollow to Canada and just the importance of their support. And, with our parcel, it's small, but, we think it's very special, but apparently others think so as well. And we were able to conserve our land because of the innovation of Cold Hollow to Canada, working with New England Forestry Foundation and bringing several landowners together who had smaller but special parcels and conserving our properties at the same time, even though they're separate. So that was a very innovative project that Cold Hollow to Canada spearheaded. And it never would have happened without them. And since then, we had such a good experience with NEF, New England Forestry Foundation, that NEF has since conserved about 1,000 acres or more in Montgomery, in a couple of different parcels, and have more projects in our area too. So they're really they've been a great resource too. So, but it was a daunting process without that support, and we use the same term of hand holding. That's definitely what was going on with us when it was all happening. So I really echo what Sarah said. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan, and thanks for the testimonial. I'm so very pleased to be able to let Dave know and Nancy and people at Cold Hollow the snaps that they're getting tonight, and they're kind of it's a newer capacity relationship for VHCB, but we're so excited about the way they do business, and again the fact that they just go above and beyond to help landowners understand. And I think that comes from having this kind of like limited geographical service area where you can get to know all the players better, and that's definitely, this is all about relationships.
No, they're amazing. It's an amazing cruise. Feel very lucky.
Hope that Nancy Patch isn't mad at me because she created me as a conservationist, but maybe on this one she.
Joan, did you want to ask your question about Act 81 and VCP?
Or 181.
181.
Yeah, I'm just not understanding this, but I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between Act 181 and the Vermont Conservation Plan and how it relates, and a little bit about the mapping that's being proposed for Act 181. That would be helpful.
This is another thing that comes up quite a bit, is trying to understand where there are connections, because of course, Act 59 is dealing with the perpetual conservation system which is mostly private and publicly owned land, and the legal arrangements that protect that. But it's all basically sort of voluntary. Whereas Act 181 was a set of kind of generational changes to the state's land use regulation that we call Act 250. Act 250 has been around since I think nobody needs a tutorial on this probably, but Act 250 has been around since the early 1970s, and it establishes a set of criteria that commercial development projects and subdivisions need to go through in order to get a permit to go forward. The permit that's issued does then go into the land record. So that's a first kind of like comparison between permanent conservation and Act 250, is that when you give an easement on your land to Cold Hollow to Canada and NEF, they file it in the land records, and it's there forever. It's in perpetuity. And when you get a permit from Act 250, it goes into the land record, and those conditions, you move on and your business moves on or whatever, but the conditions still stay with the land. So that's one way that they're similar. They're connected in mapping, but not in the mapping I think you were asking about. The regional planning commissions were supposed to do maps of proposed areas for development, the tier 1A and 1B areas that are going to have lessened Act 250 jurisdiction, so easier to get your permit or no permit required for certain kinds of activities, especially housing. And so that's the mapping that's going on. I don't see any RPC members here tonight, but the regional planners have been working on that. And I think those are coming out towards the end of this calendar year, maybe, or maybe, I don't know, drafts are starting to emerge, but I think they get adopted 8 months out or something. So those maps establish the places that are where Act 250 jurisdiction is removed for the purposes of development. But again, that doesn't, if you have a farm and if your community maps the tier 1A and 1B areas for development, and you've got a farm that's in tier 1B area, that doesn't mean that you have to sell your farm to a developer for housing. But it does mean that if you wanted to, you could, and there would be no Act 250 jurisdiction there. There would be no process around Act 250 for that. You could also conserve it instead of getting a permit to put a Walmart there. So, it doesn't really change your relationship to the question of whether to conserve or not. And if you're already conserved, it doesn't change your rights and obligations as a conserved parcel. Where it is connected in the mapping, stop me if this is too many connections and not connections, but I think this is the sort of fascinating way that it's connected is that Act 181 also said that there should be areas that have more jurisdiction, right? Where we're going to be more protected. If these 1A and 1B are going to be less protected, let's talk about places that should have more protections to them. And so that's what has really kind of confused people and gotten people riled up is like, what's the connection between the road rule or tier 3 or the new criterion 8C that affects kind of interior forest blocks and connectivity? Like, what do those mean? They don't mean anything in terms of permanent conservation, first of all, but we are using some of the same science. So when A&R is thinking about, like, they made some recommendation, a very discrete set of things that they thought should have the heightened jurisdiction of tier 3. And it was like specific connectivity areas where forests are coming together, natural communities, and maybe it was like headwater forests or something like that, or maybe riparian corridors or something. So it was a very limited set of places, but in those places to do commercial activity or subdivision, it doesn't say you can't do it, but you now have to get a permit, even if you're doing like a single subdivision and 2 houses, so it instead of having it be the full-blown Act 250 process, it's a smaller process on a smaller area because it's potentially affecting this uber sensitive feature on the landscape. So those sensitive features are mapped in Vermont Conservation Design for that, just in the same way that they are for conservation. And so there's a connection there. But otherwise, conservation is a voluntary system that depends upon willing landowners and willing organizations. It's good at parcel by parcel work. Regulatory systems are good at doing things over a whole area or for a whole corridor or for a whole town, and applying the same rules across, similar parts of the landscape. So you would think you would want multiple strategies to both for development and protection. And that's one way it comes together, is that this is part of what we need to help landowners understand and navigate. Because it's like everything got more complicated in the last 4 years.
Great, thanks for that. Ken, I think that you might be our last question of the night. We're at 6:55, and I want to let people off the hook right around 7. So Ken, if you want to close us out with our last question.
Sure. So what I see as a real problem is for the folks who have their property in current use, if they were to conserve that parcel, there's very little tax incentive to do that. And I think the state really needs to step up here and say, conserve properties, being that they're not going to be developed, you have to give the landowner a better tax break than just if it's in current use. Because I had a neighbor that conserved 400 acres that was already in current use. When it got conserved, his taxes did not go down on the parcel. And I think that's an essential thing that has to be addressed.
It is. I don't know. Do you want to say any more about that, Ken, before I just thank you for that.
No, go ahead, Trey.
Well, that's a great final thought, is that because that's a double-edged sword, my friends. It's, on the one hand, we want rural landowners to be empowered and supported to manage lands as forests and as farms. And some jurisdictions out west really lower the tax rate of lands that are in grazing, or that are in farming, or that are in forest, and cut that down. And I've heard the lieutenant governor call for like $1 a year per acre for working lands, and other things like that. But there was a question earlier from somebody in the room about how much it costs to the communities when we conserve lands and take it off the tax rolls for purposes of the education fund. So this is one that's sort of tricky. And as I said, it's usually conservation. If you're doing that for a tax benefit, it's usually not the right reason to do it, because conservation alone doesn't generally change the tax status of the property. If it, especially if you're conserving a working farm, you're not really changing its current use in a way that's going to really, the listers are going to say, okay, this is different. But when you go into the use value appraisal program, you can, that's one of the major incentives to go into it, is the tax break. So people do it for that alone. So it's interesting how we get towards similar outcomes from two different programs that people might enter into for two very really different reasons. But anyways, yes, I don't know that I think VHCB is ready to recommend that we can zero out the tax bills for conserved lands. But we've certainly heard a lot of people say, should there be options within the current use program that would increase the benefit for people who would do more than just the land use change tax lien? Like, what if somebody was willing to put a semi-permanent or permanent restriction on development into their current use plan? Should that get a higher level of tax benefit? But if you were Emily Kornheiser and I forget who the chair of Senate Finance is right now, Ann Cummings, I think, you would be really worried about increasing the cost of the current use program right now. And so you might say, sure, we can recognize a higher value for people who do more, but then we're going to have to take away some of the value for others. So make the program pay for itself, but you tell us what the criteria are. And some states do that. They have like 3 or 4 different checks. And if you do all 4 checks, if your land is open, if it's conserved from development, if it's managed for productivity, and if it's whatever the other thing would be, then you get the full tax benefit. But if you take any of those away, you get less of a benefit. So that's when I've heard people ask about, increasing the benefit under current use, it's generally the bean counters say, how are we going to pay for that? Because it's about a $50 million a year program already.
Yeah, I just think, current use is great for those folks, but it's it's not conserving the land, Trey.
Well,
So
we didn't recognize it as permanently conserved in our inventory either. But there's a conversation about this happening at the State House right now, and there are a lot of people who think that for the purposes of 2050, where the legislature said primarily be perpetually conserved, but also have long-term mechanisms, does current use count for that? And I think, Ken, we might agree that current use isn't really durable at the parcel level, because you can pay the lien and take it out. And the development value is often way higher than that lien cost. But as a program, it's been extraordinarily durable. And the 2.3 million acres enrolled has not changed much over 3 decades. So, and it's been sort of steady up as opposed to steady down. So is there some way we should factor that into our planning and where we spend money for perpetual conservation and stewardship, if a lot of the landscape is protected under a voluntary program that is extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily successful? That's something we're really wrestling with right now. But we don't need to wrestle with it at 7:01, I don't think.
Thank you, Trey.
You can.
Well, great. Thank you all so much for coming and chatting with us. This was really informative. I know I learned a lot, and I really appreciate everyone's questions. Trey, thank you so much for all of your answers. I can't believe that you have so many things on the tip of your tongue and you're just able to pull from so many different areas and different knowledge. So thank you for sharing that with us tonight. And we will follow up with everyone with an email with some of the different resources that we mentioned. But yeah, thank you all.
Can I add one more thing? Just I put the link in the chat, but if you have additional feedback for VHCB, I believe you can give it at vermontconservationplan.com. And alternatively, you can send anyone at the Conservation District feedback, and we can also pass it along to VHCB. So please do that.
I was going to say the same thing. Conservationplan.com. There's a survey, or you can find my email there and just write me a long letter, or even better, a short letter. But anyway, yes, there's lots of ways to send thoughts and questions in, and if you want to schedule a conversation because this was just whetted your appetite, but you got more questions, you can also reach out to Arena or Carrie if you've got CD questions, or to me if you've got VHCB questions.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Thank you. Bye.
Good evening.